I've come to the exciting part of my workbench project now, and that's making the top. Now all the other parts, the base and the drawer assemblies and cases, are all part of the supporting cast, so to speak. Whenever I'm doing any woodworking in my own shop, it's going to be interacting with the top of the bench. Now, just because it's a workbench top doesn't mean that it serves the same function. In fact, there's a lot going on with the top. So I'm going to start with the middle section, and really a workbench on a lot of projects just needs to be a large, flat work surface. So this middle section is going to be about 1¼ inch thick white fir that I'm going to be using. Later on, I'll add a much thicker front section, and that's where a lot of the heavy work is going to be, where I'm going to need to clamp pieces in place for planing or carving or sawing. Along the back, I'm going to add a thicker strip, but that's only for rigidity along the back edge, and then 2 end caps will help keep the whole top stable. So like I said, I'm starting with the middle section, and I have here 2 boards. Now because I have access to a wider planer, I can leave it as 2 boards. If you don't have a wide planer, you can just glue it up out of more boards. Not a big deal. So I planed them to the thickness that I wanted, and then I took the 2 boards over to the jointer where I made a few passes on the glue edge here just to clean up and straighten the edge. Now you want to check your work periodically and then line up the boards to see how well they're coming together. I have a small gap right in the middle, which is going to be fine because as I apply clamping pressure, it's going to close that up and it'll help keep the glue joint stable over time. So once the center glue line is jointed, then I went over to the table saw and ripped them to its final width so that I'll have a parallel center section here. Now working with long boards can be a little dicey. I kind of like having outfeed support to catch the boards as they come off the saw. On the infeed side, I don't usually find that necessary, and instead I can use just a shuffling hand over hand motion, keeping the workpiece firmly against the rip fence. So that's where I am here, ready to glue things up. It's easy to go crazy when you're gluing up a panel like this, but I want just a thin, even bead of glue across the surface here so that when I clamp it up, I get a little bit of squeeze out, but it's not running all over the place. Okay, then I can set it in place on the clamps. Now since I've taken the time to plane these to the same thickness, I really want to keep this upper surface level as I tighten up the clamp. So I'm going to start in the middle, and I can apply a little bit of pressure. Then I'll start with one of the bar clamps on the top. Now it's just a matter of working my way out towards the ends. All right, there you have it. I have that all clamped up. This is kind of like the small string of beads that I kind of want to see here. A couple of places it's a little bit more than I want. I did find out at the end here that it was a little uneven, so I just grabbed a small bar clamp, pulled it across there to level out the joints. If you do find places where it's a little offset more than you want, you can come by, loosen up the clamp, hit it with a mallet, and drive them together and then tighten up the clamps again. So after about an hour, I can pull the clamps off, scrape the glue, and we're ready for the next step. Now that the center section of my workbench is out of the clamps, I can cut it to its final length. It's a pretty big piece to try and do at the table saw, so I grabbed a track saw. I used a piece of foam insulation underneath the top to protect the top of my workbench. Well, the workbench here in the studio anyway. That way I could make a cut on one end, mark its final length, and cut the other end. What I want to do now is provide a little extra rigidity to the bench top. Even though this is fairly thick fir, I want to strengthen it as much as possible. So what I'm going to do is install a pair of cleats on the bottom side. They're going to fit into dovetail-shaped dados that run across the full width of the underside of the top. Now, fitting a sliding dovetail on its own can be pretty tricky. So what I'm doing here instead is creating a tapered sliding dovetail. So this end of the dado is 1/8 of an inch wider than this end. Doesn't seem like much, but when I get the cleat fit, as we'll see in a little bit, once it goes in, it'll slide in real easy, and then just at the very end, locks everything up tight. Still allows for the top to be able to expand and contract with changes in humidity, but really adds to the strength of the top. So I'll need to make this channel in several passes. On the last one, I'm going to shift my edge guide over just 1/8 of an inch and create that tapered edge. All right, to make the battens or the cleats that are going to go on the bottom side of the workbench top, I need to cut matching dovetails on them. So for this first side, what I'm going to do is establish cut using that same dovetail bit, but here I've installed it in the router table and I've set it to the same height that I used in the handheld router. So once I make a pass along each edge here, then we'll have to set up to make a tapered cut on the other side. Now the first edge of our cleat has a dovetailed rabbet cut on the edge of it that's straight, follows the parallel edge of the cleat itself. What that means is that the one on the other side needs to taper to match the angle of the taper that I routed into the underside of the bench top. Now it sounds like that might be kind of complicated to do, but there's an easy way to accomplish it. What I've done is cut a strip that I can use as a spacer, and then on one edge of it, I cut a taper with a bandsaw and then planed it down to the right size. Now you want that taper to match the taper of the dado on the bottom side of the workbench. But there's a trick here. The cleat is extra long, and we want that taper to match only the width of our bench top. So what I've done is laid out these lines that show the overall width of the bench top. And then from this line to this line, the taper has to move in just 1/8 of an inch. So after marking that line and running it and planing down to that line, I'm ready to use that as a reference edge along the fence of the router table. I'm going to make this in a couple of passes, just like I did before, working from wider to narrower, and then test fitting as I go in the underside of the bench top. Now before we get to installing the cleats on the workbench top, I want to talk a little bit about troubleshooting. In the course of routing the tapered edge on your cleat and test fitting, you're going to find a couple of things can happen. One is as you slide it into the dado, either you can try and pull up on the front or the back edge, and if you get a little movement there, that means that your taper doesn't quite match the taper on the top. So wherever it's tight, so if you can lift up on the back and it's tight at the front, you'll need to trim a little bit off of your spacer and then reroute that edge. Don't change anything on the router table fence. Just make a couple of swipes with a hand plane on that spacer, reroute it, and then test the fit again. You can feel like you're going back and forth a lot, but after a few trips to the router table and using your hand plane, you'll get it dialed in kind of tight. Now I will say you might reach a point of frustration that it's just not going together and you're pretty close. If that's the case, what I'll do then is take a couple of the shavings that I've made from my spacer and just glue them to the edge of the cleat wherever it's a little bit loose. And you can do that with multiple layers. I use a fast setting glue. This one's from Tight Bond that works really well because you can just put down a thin bead of glue, rub the plain shaving in there and it sticks, and in less than a half an hour it's dry. You can add a few layers if you need to, and then you're all set to go. The next thing you'll want to do is cut your cleats to their final length. Now what you want to do here is, I'm making this bench and it's in the summer, so this panel is about as wide as it's going to get. So I've trimmed it so that it's a little bit narrower both at the front and back edge. That way when winter comes and this thing shrinks up a little bit, I'm not going to have the cleat sticking out where it's going to interfere with some of the other work that we need to do. So when that's the case, you can just put it in, drive it home. Get the other one. There we go. Now we can turn to the next part of making the bench top, and that's wrapping it around with some solid wood pieces. I mentioned earlier that the different parts of the workbench top serve different purposes. The main section in the middle is just a flat work area. Along the front is kind of a heavy work zone. So I want to have a stout area to be able to put some dog holes in, to stand up to planing, chopping, all that kind of heavy work that you'll do near to you. So it's going to end up being 3 layers of wood that are cut to 4 inches wide and stood on edge. Now, the front edge gets glued on a little bit later because it's kind of overlapping the whole construction. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a bit, so I'll just set this out of the way. For the 2 inner layers, they can be glued up now, but there's one thing that I want to do first. I've taken the vise off of my existing workbench. I really like it. It's a quick release vise and it serves me really well, so I'd like to use it on this bench too. But what I want to do is on the back side, this inner jaw I want to have recessed so that it's not exposed on the front edge. That'll be 2 wood jaws then when I clamp something to the front edge of my bench. In order to accommodate that, I want to cut out this inner section, this inner piece, to wrap around this jaw. That way I can attach the vise and it'll work just fine. So I'm going to do that with a jigsaw before getting into gluing up the 2 inner pieces. And gluing those up is really just a matter of applying a bunch of squiggly lines of glue between these 2 and then adding enough clamps to keep them nice and tight. While the glue up on the front edge pieces of the workbench dry, we can do a little bit more work on the panel here. Now I want to attach the front piece, the single layer for the back, and the 2 end caps and glue them in place. What I want to do is, with these long glue ups, make sure that the joints stay even. So what I'm going to do is route a slot all the way around the edges. And I'm going to do that with a handheld router here. And I've set up a 1/4 inch slot cutting bit and a bearing guides it as I just trace all the way around. And then once I have the slot routed on the center piece, I'm going to install this bit over in the router table and use that with the same bit height to route a matching groove in all of my edging parts. Now when I go to glue on my pieces, I can use a few hardboard splines that I've cut that will join them together, register the pieces, and help keep those parts flush while the glue is drying on those. All right, now it's time to turn the disparate parts of our workbench top into a solid assembly. And we're going to do that by gluing on this double layer front block and the back piece. Once we have that clamped up and the glue set up a little bit, then we can take care of capping the ends, and then we'll wrap things up with the front edge. So to get started here, I've marked a line to show the thickness of the top so I know exactly how much glue I want to apply. And apply a bead of glue all the way down here. And again, I want to brush it out for good coverage. Now I have my hardboard spline pieces here, and they're used primarily for registration. The long grain glue joint that we have here is pretty strong as it is. So if you want to, you can add glue to the spline slots. If you don't want to, don't worry about it. For me, I'm usually a more glue is better kind of person, so I'll put some in. And then fit the splines in place. All right, now I'm just going to repeat the process for this back piece. All right, now I can begin to apply the clamping pressure. I'm going to work from the center towards the ends. All right, there we go. Like I said, we'll let this set up a little bit and then we'll cap things off with the ends. The next two pieces that we're adding to the bench top are the end caps. And there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that I went over to the router table and I used the largest roundover bit that I had to round over the back end of the end cap. It provides a nice transition because it doesn't run flush to the back, and I'll get to that in a moment. Just like the front and back pieces, I'm joining it using a spline. However, this spline and this joint is a cross grain connection. So I have the long grain of the end cap going on the width of my center panel. And I want that center panel to still expand and contract. So what I've done is glued the spline into the end cap, but I'm only going to glue probably this first third of the end cap in place. That way any expansion and contraction can take place on the back, and that's where that roundover comes into play. So as it moves, you're not really going to notice anything. Later on, once the glue's dry, I'm going to add a few screws on the end cap, again, just to hold the end cap in place, but still allow the top to move back and forth. We're down to the last piece to add on the bench top here. And since we've been talking about creating a rigid assembly, there's a couple of things that are hidden that I want to show you. The first is I drilled a pair of holes into the ends of all the cleats, both this one and the one down here, and I'm going to connect the cleats to the front and back aprons with some long dowels here. So what this does is add just even more rigidity to the base. All right, now the final piece, this front part of the apron, is going to cover up those dowel holes. It's also going to cover up the ends of the end caps that we put on earlier, give a nice clean edge. Now in the plans, you'll notice that this is where, when you're building up this whole front assembly, is where that tail vise is going to go. I'm opting to skip the tail vise on it. I'm just using a face vise on the front, and then once the glue is dry, I'm going to drill a series of dog holes along the front edge for all those common bench accessories. All right, once the clamps come off of the bench top, it's time to clean it up. There's going to be some glue lines and maybe a little unevenness that you need to take care of. Now, the more care you put into gluing up not only the center panel, but when you start adding the front and rear aprons and the end caps is where it's going to pay off in smoothing it. Now, I like to do the job, especially when I'm working with softer materials like this white fur, is to do it with a sharp hand plane. My process is kind of in 3 stages. The first is I'll take a series of passes straight across the bench top from front to back. And I'll do that slightly overlapping each pass as I work my way down. There you can get a good understanding of just how flat it is and remove a lot of material pretty quickly. Then I'm going to make 2 sets of diagonal passes. First I'll go diagonal in one direction, again working from one end of the bench to the other. Then I'll switch directions with the plane and go the opposite diagonal. And what this does is help keep the whole surface flat. And the longer of the plane that you use, the better that's going to be. And then finally, just as you saw, I'll make a series of lengthwise passes, and that'll clean up those diagonal plane marks, and then get the surface ready for work. How flat and smooth you want to go is really up to you. I'm going to leave the plane tracks that are on there. I think it feels nice on there. It's going to help grip a workpiece once I clamp it to the top. As you can see, I have it installed on the base of the bench that I made earlier. And this part is really simple. What I did is I attached a pair of cleats to the inside on the base of the bench, just with some screws. And then on the bench top, I used pocket screws and installed another set of cleats. That way the two cleats interlock, and as you can see, it's not going to move end to end. If you really want to, you can add some screws through the cleats to pin them together. I think I'm just going to let gravity do the work for me. I have a little bit left to do in terms of fitting out both the bench top and getting the drawers installed, so I'll see you at the finale. I'm calling it. This workbench is now done, and I frankly can't wait to get it home to my shop. But there's a few things that I wanted to point out here as we wrap things up. First, I got the top in place. We talked about the bench dog holes earlier. I also drilled a row of bench dog holes across the middle of the bench, and that's to secure a workpiece to the top using holdfasts or hold downs. Now, if you remember back when I made the drawer case, the upper drawers aren't as deep as the other ones, and that's to create some space for the stem of the holdfast to drop into place without contacting that drawer case. Now, another thing is I needed to add a vise to the front, and I rescued the one from my old bench because I really liked how well it worked. It's a quick release vise, which is really handy. The only thing is that I added a new walnut jaw to the front. I have a walnut tool case in my shop that I wanted to complement with this. Also, I added walnut stained drawer knobs to the front, again just to complement that tool cabinet that I have. One of the main features that I like about this bench is that I have a flush surface here from the bench top down to the main base of it. And then this front apron forms a lip that I can clamp pieces to. So whether I'm working with a long board or a wide panel, I can clamp that right in place on the front. There's still room behind that apron to get at the dog holes, so they're not trapped in there. All in all, this was a really fun project to build. I pretty much followed the plans from woodsmithplans.com with a few modifications that you've seen along the way. I'd love to hear what you think and if you want to build one of these benches for your own shop. Thanks for watching.